computer. Let's do that. All right. Okay, it's recording.
Hello, Rob. Hi, Phil.
And
Hello. Hi there. Oh gosh, everyone's here. Okay, that's lovely. Terrific. Oh, I'm looking forward to this. Hello, Alison.
Hello.
Nice to see you again.
You too.
Great, great. Hello, Alex. I can't see you. And Lene, I don't. And am I pronouncing your name correctly?
It's Lene.
Hi, Rob.
Lene.
Yeah.
Lene.
Hi, nice to meet you too.
Great, good. Lovely.
Hi, Rob. Nice to see you.
Indeed. How are you, Marco?
Fine, thank you. Well.
Oh, Ellie. Hello, Ellie. Hi. Ellie, where are you?
I'm in Joburg, actually.
Okay.
Yes, I came back just before lockdown. So.
Okay. All right. Good. Good to see you.
Good
to see you. You've got a lovely garden growing behind you.
It expands as lockdown continues. The plants seem to expand. So.
Okay. Great. Well, it's nice to know something is flourishing. Lovely. I'm looking forward to the seminar. Thank you very much, everyone.
My watch is a bit fast. It says
mine says
5 minutes past.
Oh, mine says 4 o'clock exactly.
Yep.
Okay. You're two. Okay. Should we give it 2 more minutes or?
2 minutes is good.
Yeah, that's good.
Because we've got 28 participants now, and
yeah, there's supposed to be 75. Actually, at the moment, I've got a total of 75 that RSVP'd.
a few more minutes. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to get going. Welcome to the second Faces of the City for the third quarter. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get going. We generally run these things with people's videos off except for the speaker and on mute if at all possible. So we'd appreciate it if you could turn your videos off and just have, thank you so much. I'd just like to welcome you all to this session, and today we have 4 speakers who are editors of the book Densifying the City in question mark, and we're going to be presenting some of the chapters from the book and some of the key ideas, and I'm very happy and very grateful to see many of the authors of the book who are here. So we'll be going through a presentation from the 4 editors. That's going to be Ali Alexandra Applebaum, Alison Todis, Philip Harrison, and myself, Margot Rubin. I'll also be chairing the session. So it will be basically a 40-minute presentation of discussion of the book, and then we'll be taking some questions and discussion. Great, and then let's see. I'd like to also ask the speakers just to introduce themselves very briefly before we get going. Ali, let me start with you, and then on to Alison, and then Phil, and then myself. Just a quick one line.
Can you hear me? Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Ali Applebaum. I used to work at WITS with Margot and Phil and Alison in the research chair in spatial analysis and city planning. It's not my fault that that name is so long. And I'm now a PhD student at Berkeley in city planning.
Great, thanks, Ali. Alison, do you want to turn your camera and your video and your voice on so we can hear you and see you?
I'm
There we go.
Alison Todis. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm Alison Todis. I'm a professor in planning in the School of Architecture and Planning at WITS.
Thanks.
Okay.
Phil?
Great to see everyone. I'm Philip Harrison, and I have a research chair in the School of Architecture and Planning at WITS. I won't mention the long name. Thanks to everyone for coming.
Thanks, Phil. And I'm Margot Rubin. I'm an associate professor in the chair with a very long name, the NRF chair in spatial analysis and city planning, which basically means that Phil is my boss. So let's put it that way. And so we'll have an order of speakers. It's going to be Ali, then Phil, then Alison, and then myself to close off. And then we'll get into it. So I don't think we need much further ado. Ali, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, I'm just trying to share my screen. Okay. Oh no, why is it doing that?
Oh, you need to. Oh, there you go.
Okay, Margot, can you just confirm you can all see that?
Sorry, yes, we can see that, and we can see your presentation. We can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So thanks so much to everyone for joining us today, and especially to those who've been involved in the very long process of book. In today's event, we plan to give you a preview of this book, Densifying the City, which is set to be published by Edward Elgar Press in November this year. Oh, there we go. So I wish we could say that when we first began working on this book about 3 years ago, we knew that urban density would become one of the major debates of 2020 because the world would be struck by the COVID pandemic. If we'd known this, perhaps I would have improved my technological skills and learned how to make wine at home. But while this coronavirus was not yet an issue, densification was already a highly contested topic. The debate around densification was, and still remains, highly normative and polarized. So we set out to bring together a book that looked beyond the normative theorizing. Instead of arguing whether densification is good or bad, this book examines the complex and varied spatial and socioeconomic realities of densification. The chapters in this volume look at policies and processes of densification that have manifested in unanticipated or contrary ways. They highlight the roles of various policy actors, of private developers, and crucially of residents in densifying and sometimes de-densifying cities. The book constructs a comparative conversation, putting Johannesburg in dialogue with cities across the global north and south, mostly within Africa and the BRICS. So in today's seminar, you'll be relieved to hear that we're not planning to take you through the 25 chapters and 336 pages of the book. Instead, in our limited time, I'm briefly going to give you some background on the book project, take you through the table of contents, and Phil and Alison will then take you through some of the key findings and themes in the first two chapters, which respectively look at the global cases and the Johannesburg case. Then, before we open for questions and discussion, since we are in the midst of a pandemic and density has become an even more debated topic, Margot will talk to us about COVID-19 and densification. So first, on our background to the book, this book developed out of two broad areas of work at the research chair in partnership with the Wits School of Architecture and Planning. So the first project with the GCRO looked at urban resilience with a focus on density. And then came out of that, there was a second NRF-funded project which looked at densification in Johannesburg from a comparative global perspective. A second set of projects looked at transit-oriented development in Johannesburg, the project called the Corridors of Freedom, which sought to increase Johannesburg's densities around key nodes as a way to address some of the spatial inequities of apartheid city planning. On this project we worked with the French Development Bank, the City of Johannesburg Development Planning Department, Plan Act, and University College London. So we've been really grateful in this process to have such wonderful partnerships. Densification had also been a focus of conversations that we were having in the BRICS City Lab network. In December 2017, we hosted a workshop in Johannesburg with colleagues from the BRICS City Lab, from our various projects at Wits, and other colleagues working on densification in South Africa who had responded to our open call. This workshop was the official start of the book project, and we are thrilled that almost 3 years later, the book is about to be published. So the book is divided into 3 sections. This is the table of contents of section 1. Section 1 begins with the 2 introductory chapters, which Phil and Alison will take us through shortly. These synthesize and draw together key findings from the international cases and the Johannesburg case. The section provides an account of the international literature and then deals with the 8 international case studies, bringing the densification experiences of these cities into discussion with the Johannesburg experience. Section 2 then provides an explanation of the different expressions of densification in Johannesburg. These include suburban infill, gated communities, the partly financialized tower block urbanism in the upmarket nodes of the city, incremental alterations of existing dwellings, informal settlements, backyard accommodation, and intensified occupancy of buildings in the inner city and surrounding suburbs. And then finally, section 3 is policy focused, providing an analysis of Johannesburg's TOD policy, the Corridors of Freedom, and its relationship to densification. The book works iteratively between the international examples and the Johannesburg case study. It brings insights from the international examples to think about densification in Joburg and engages inductively from the particularities of Joburg to contribute to a global discussion. So what I think we all think is the most important slide in this presentation before I hand it over to Phil. So as editors, we just really want to say a huge public thank you, not only to our wonderful authors for their very hard work and their extreme patience with the editorial team, but also to so many people who've helped us create this volume. We hope that with its publication in November, Densifying the City can provide some much needed nuance and empirical complexity to the densification debates. And we're so grateful to everyone who helped make this book a reality. Thanks.
Super, thanks so much, Ali. Let me hand straight on to Phil.
Thank you very much. I'm just sharing the screen. Give me a second. Come on. Okay, almost there. Okay. So thanks very much. And Ali has explained the sort of iterative method behind the book, and that's why there are 2 introductory chapters. The first, which I'll talk you through briefly, looks at the broad context for the book, the selected international case studies, and the themes that those case studies raise that help sharpen the focus for a study on Joburg, And then Alison will talk specifically about the focus on Joburg and how Joburg speaks back to a broader context. So I hardly need to tell this audience who have a city planning background that in fact modern city planning originated in an antipathy towards density, and the sort of pioneering town planner, social reformer, Sir Ebenezer Howard, saying it's deeply to be deplored that people should continue to stream into the already overcrowded cities. And there are many other quotes. And Louis Mumford, limitations on size, density, and area are absolutely necessary. They're the most important instruments of rational economic and civic planning. And it's quite remarkable that given this background, that by the second half of the 20th century, there was the turn towards density as a positive attribute. The work of Jane Jacobs, of course, what makes cities great is their density, which produces vitality. Economists with their focus on the importance of agglomeration economies, and very significantly, of course, the environmental movement and the link between density and ideas of sustainability and resilience, and the critique of the sprawling, inefficient, energy-intensive, car-dependent cities. And so certainly over the last 2 decades or so, density has come to be regarded, at least in policy circles, as a highly desirable goal. And in fact, most of those ideas that we work with as planners, smart cities, TOD, urban compaction, the new urbanism, require density. And if you look at what's coming out of the World Bank, certainly the new urban agenda, which calls for policies that would harness densities and economies of scale, OECD, UN Habitat, you would certainly think that there's a new policy consensus around the benefits of densification. But I think it is important to say that it's actually an unresolved issue. The debate hasn't been fully settled, and there certainly are critics. You might know the work of Shlomo Angel from New York University and New York University's Urban Expansion Program, which is also based on empirical study and shows that most large urban agglomerations across the world have been at the agglomeration scale have been de-densifying, notwithstanding what policies towards density, and so their argument for pragmatic accommodation of growth. Certainly if you look at what's happening in practice, there's a lot more diversity than the so-called policy consensus might suggest. And someone wrote, and it's not my words, the epidemic of new city development. But really the new wave of new city development, not to be normative, is really about an attempt to de-densify the historical urban centers. It's not necessarily anti-density, because the new cities often are planned in quite a dense form, but it's a different aesthetic of density, the so-called good density of environmental sustainability, as opposed to the bad densities, if you like, of the congested, often informal existing city. And so there you are. That's the very influential, Angel's very influential Atlas of Human Expansion, and that I think is Forest City in Malaysia, the new aesthetic of density. And I think the other important thing to say is that the shift in density among policymakers and planners was never paralleled in any simple way by shifts in popular attitude. And that is why I think, and Margot will talk to that, but that is why an anti-density discourse so easily resurfaces, and to some extent has resurfaced. We don't, of course, know, and we don't have the benefit of hindsight, and we don't know whether the turn against density will take root and so on, but we don't have that benefit. But in engaging with the policy literature, we do have the benefit of quite substantial scholarly literature. And there are many writers perhaps starting from Churchman in 1999, but others like Boyko and Cooper, Holman et al., Goodman, more recently Charms and Kale, and McFarlane, of course, and Perez's is a wonderful recent piece on densification in Bogota, Colombia. So there is a very considerable scholarly literature, and we've used it and we've built on it, and it's helped us with our understanding of our own context. And there's a lot of complexity that comes out of that. And these are some of the themes that emerge, just really challenging the abstracted discussions of density as a decontextualized technical matter into a much greater complexity of meaning and understanding, understanding the relationship between density and the many other factors that shape the city, such as urban form and the quality of space and so on. The really contextually situated outcomes, both positive and negative, of different forms of density. The highly dynamic and fluid nature of density, its unpredictable effects, the extent to which it's both supported and contested, how density it really translates through perceptions and lived experience, and very important, the politics of density, and how the discourse around density often obscures the interests that are played either for or against density. And the technical language and the claims to density or to de-densifying, furthering, were presenting normative ideals that might be framed in terms of environmental discourse that are very difficult to challenge, but certainly obscure real interests. And so these are the significant themes. Of course, there are risks in taking a critical approach, risks that in unmasking density and the interests and politics around density, we might forget the extent to which positions on density really represent the outcomes of long contested and progressive processes of policy and scholarly evolution. But that's something for debate. But as Ali said, we were as careful as possible, not that we don't have normative positions, but as careful as possible not to present the book and to take normative positions in the book. So for us, one of the questions is really, how do we begin to move the debate forward? We understand that density is intensely heterogeneous. There are multiple forms of density. And because of that, we require a really wide geographic spread of knowledge and a real attentiveness to context and to place. We need that greater geographical reach. And the geographical reach, although it has been expanding, I've mentioned the work of Perez, for example, in relation to Colombia, is still quite narrow. And at the same time, we're facing this growing gap, and most of us straddle the policy world and the world of scholarship. And we're very aware of this growing gap between this more critical work and the more normative approach. And how do we begin to bridge this? How do we begin to bring the sense of complexity into policy studies and contextuality into policy studies, while at the same time bringing the work of critical scholarship towards a productive purpose in confronting our very real challenges. And so we didn't necessarily take a southern perspective, and that's why our selection of cities are not all from the south. It's more of a cosmopolitan urbanism, trying to bring diverse perspectives from many places across the world, but there is a bias towards cities in the south because that's the underrepresented parts of the world. And so our approach really was to take the deep dive into Johannesburg, to focus on place-based thinking, but to place it iteratively in relation to the cosmopolitan urbanism, to comparative study. These were the cities. If I had more time, I would have asked you to guess which city was which. But there really are a range of cities. The massive city of Sao Paulo, the much smaller city of Curitiba in Brazil, taken a very different path to Sao Paulo. Istanbul, Istanbul straddling 2 continents, Delhi, one of the most densely packed cities in the world, but also includes New Delhi with its huge bungalows and very low densities. Beijing, which at a metropolitan scale is de-densifying, but some parts of the city are certainly increasing in density. Maputo, a much smaller city, much closer to home, with densification happening in the areas of expansion around the edge. Nairobi, it's not just those, it's not just Kibera and the other famous informal settlements, but also the tenements, which Marie Huchmeyer has written about since she's contributed to our book. And Sydney, it's not Durban, it looks like Durban, but it's Sydney. And Johannesburg, with its very peculiar patterns of densification, the higher points of density around the edge of the metropolitan city. And so from these international case studies, a number of themes have emerged. I must just watch the time now, so I'm going to shoot through the themes. The first theme is about temporality, because density is not a stable category, meaning shift, attitudes evolve. Yes, there's the broad global trajectory of shifting from a sort of anti-position in relation to density towards this embrace of density in policy, and now we're not so sure. But this broad trajectory is always layered onto local histories, local cultures, local politics, and so there are many twists, local twists, national twists, regional twists to the tale. And all our cases show variations from this sort of oversimplified international trajectory, and that's certainly one of the themes which emerges. As the authors of the case on Istanbul point out, density is one of the most chaotic terms in urban studies. And there certainly are multiple forms and ways of representing density, of measuring density, of understanding density. This enduring contradiction between density as this mark of or urbanity on the one hand, but also the many anxieties, the popular anxieties that surround dense urban living. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of understanding and measurement, but one theme, if I can just pick up one theme in relation to this, is that scale really, really matters. And a lot of the difference in positions around density has to do, and which have implications for policy, has to do with the scale at which density is measured. I'll come back to this slide. Certainly, if you look at the scale of a city region or at the scale of a metropolitan city, most of the agglomerations are de-densifying because of sprawl. But if you look at the scale of the core city, the picture is often very different. There are often multiple processes of densification at work and some processes of de-densification in some places. If you look at a neighborhood scale, it's even more varied. And so one of the themes that comes out and conclusions that comes out is that we need to accommodate different patterns of density and of densification and de-densification, understand them, and where they have positive outcomes for the city, accommodate them across different scales. Okay, time is really running out. So the production of density. Density is produced through multiple processes, and these processes produce density of different forms and degrees. And I've already alluded to the significance of the interplay of interests. Some of the cases, if we're looking for a political economy, such as the way in which China's reforms have led to very significant urban expansion and de-densification at the metropolitan scale, but also verticalization within core cities and some forms of densification. Sao Paulo, that very peculiar city, every 5 years it moves from left to right-wing politics with different approaches, and I could say that in relation to each of the cities. But it's not just about the imposition of density or de-densification through political change, it's also about resistance. And some of the chapters, at least, pick up the significance of resistance. Many of the chapters emphasize the importance of market forces in producing densification, but market forces are not abstracted from politics and the interplay of interests. That coalition between states, synergy between the state and developers in Sydney, or between developers and the local state in China, potent producers of density. And then, of course, a number of cases, Delhi, Nairobi, Maputo, and of course Johannesburg, showing how quasi-formal, informal forms of entrepreneurialism, not just the internationalization, sorry, the financialization, the massive inflows of financial capital into property markets, but also those local forms of those local capital flows and forms of entrepreneurialism that are producing density of different forms. And the more mundane things, infrastructure, critically important, the ring roads around Beijing, the new ring road around Maputo. Why is Shenzhen the only major large agglomeration in China that is densifying? You've got to look at its landscape. And of course, lifestyle changes, very critical. And what Johannesburg and a number of other cases do is address one of the gaps in the literature. Not that informality hasn't been addressed in the density literature, but given the significance of informal processes, hybridized, of course, with formal processes in multiple ways, given their significance, they're underrepresented in the literature. And so the diversity of different forms of informality producing density is really, I think, a critical contribution of the book. And of course, informality brings multiple policy dilemmas. And I'm just thinking of the Nairobi chapter, the way in which it shows how important those tenements are in providing access to the city. But at the same time, we're facing tenement collapse and the multiple challenges around safety, and of course now the public health issue affecting us very significantly in South Africa. Densification, certainly in the South African policy discourse, is seen as a form of inclusion, bringing more people into the mainstream of the city, and that is really, really important and is one of the important normative bases for the policy discourse in South Africa. But at the same time, there are multiple exclusionary processes that work, including through the much lauded schemes of transit-oriented development. Often the more successful those schemes are, the more displacing the effects are on the poor. We have Curitiba as a remarkable example of the most successful form of densification, perhaps, among our cities, and yet it's only really the wealthy who live along those TOD corridors, the poor still pushed out to the edge. And it's not just about those formal processes. Informal entrepreneurialism also has exploitative impacts. And so I've really run out of time. And so what I can say is that those case studies, and thanks to the authors, have really helped sharpen the focus and have clarified many of the themes. They've added nuance to the existing literature. They've added additional themes and helped address some of the gaps in the existing literature, and so helped shape the way we've been able to look at Joburg. But we hope also that our study of Joburg is able to talk back to this wider literature. And I think I'll leave it there and hand on to Alison.
Super, thanks so much, Phil.
Let me stop my share.
Great. Alison?
Okay, is it
Sure, we can see it. Yep. We just need to put it into presentation mode.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, thanks. So that's where we would argue that Joburg offers a very useful case for examining some of these issues. There are many expressions of densification in Joburg, including various types of informality. It's also a city with extreme inequality, racial inequalities, income inequalities, and questions of exclusion really come to the fore. Though, interestingly, what is different is that the property market here is not as limited as many of the cities that looked at internationally, but affordability and exclusion is a major issue. There's obviously the history of apartheid and the associated history of sprawl and fragmentation. Once there was quite low density overall historically, but very uneven spatially, with, as Phil said, quite high density in what were designated as the townships for Black African people on the edges, places like Soweto and Alexandra that you can see on the map here. But in the 1980s, apartheid began to break down. We saw quite rapid urbanization, we saw a lot of movement within the city. And in the post-apartheid period, it's been a case of where the municipality and the nation as well has theoretically has a strong normative policy commitment to compaction, to spatial transformation and inclusion. So just very briefly, there have been a number of post-apartheid compaction policies in Joburg. The spatial development frameworks in the early 2000s have focused on compaction, including urban edge, densification, a lot of attention to inner city revitalization. There's been an emphasis on nodes and corridors, a transit orientation, along with an emphasis on improving services and economies in former townships and informal areas. So what you're looking at here is the most recent spatial development framework from 2016 that talks about a compact polycentric city. And through all of this, there have been several policies to strengthen the compaction agenda and to strengthen implementation, a growth management policy linking infrastructure to spatial planning in 2008. We've had the TOD and transit-oriented development and corridors policy from 2013, a change in the land use management system to allow greater flexibilization from 2018, a visionary housing policy from 2019, and just this year, a nodal review policy. So looking at what does density look like in terms of patterns and trends, in terms of the numbers, what you're looking at here is two maps of population per square kilometer along within the boundaries of Joburg, though spilling over somewhat in 1996 and 2017. And what you can see is those basic patterns where densities are higher in the former township areas like Soweto, Alexandra, also in the inner city, and much lower density in the northern suburbs, which were historically zoned for whites. And then the shift to 2017 with the intensification of densification in the inner city, in the former townships, and also some changes in the northern suburbs. This shows the shift, and what you see here is the blue is areas of de-densification, density decline, compared to the areas where we've seen density increases in the shades of brown. Overall, what we have seen, or what we've argued, is that Joburg as a center of a larger city region has densified. The population per built area has increased from 2000 to 2018. Now, the question of measurement is, I think, is quite fraught and quite difficult. There are various data sets. What we're working with the 2018 figures is GTI data and their projections. Certainly, a lot of this kind of work could be considered more and in different ways, and there are different contributions in the literature, and we could maybe pick that up later. But what we're seeing overall, both densification and densification, and we would argue that apart from the actual focus on the specific numbers, what is more important is the pattern, is the patterns and trends and the processes involved. Some of the areas are declining, like the mining belt. In townships, seeing relocations, so an area like Alexandra, which is very high density, also has a big blue patch in it, which would be relocations from one part of the area to another. We're seeing moderate densification in the suburbs. We're seeing a lot of densification in the inner city areas. But at the same time, densification has gone along with significant growth on the city and in the north. These maps show you residential building land use change based on data from DTI. And this really just shows you what some of the main categories of residential density have been and how they've shifted over time in their spatial form. So what you're seeing there is the predominance of, not the predominance, but the significance of housing and its growth, and that would be housing. But then also very important is we're seeing very big growth in backyard housing, in townhouse complexes, and in gated communities as well. So picking up some of the themes from the papers, looking at policies, what we can note from that is quite complex relationships between density change and policy. In Joburg, quite mixed experience of policies focused on formal processes. Largely, the urban edge has held, and densification, we argue, is occurring, but more often through a loosening of controls. The COD, the corridor, has been a significant initiative, and obviously it's early days, but the outcomes have been more limited. It's been quite vulnerable as a policy to party politics, to election cycles. It's also influenced by community interests and quite a lot of oppositional community action. Bureaucratic politics has also been a concern or an impact within the municipality as well as beyond it. Developers have largely focused their sites elsewhere, but there has been some response by developers in the affordable housing and student sector, but with the limits in terms of levels of affordability and inclusion, which is a major issue for the formal policies. Sandton has been an area that is more favored by developers, but even looking at the Gauteng station and its interaction with other modes and the planning around that, it really shows the difficulty of achieving levels of spatial coordination in these multi-actor environments over the long term. The section on TOD also includes some international cases and studies that we're very grateful for, and they also raise a whole lot of questions about the expectations of TOD in contexts that are fairly similar to this one. Looking at the property market, the literature pays a lot of attention to the dominant patterns of the private market, to townhouses, to gated estates, to the growth of the north as drivers of sprawl. But it's important to note that a lot of this development is actually more dense than the older suburbs. Developers are also playing key roles in the densification of existing suburbs, and we have some articles look at that, and the densification that's occurring around the Gautrain nodes. The corridors in the inner city are some instances where developers are really working with state policy. Here it's mostly small developers, but then there is some interest shown by larger developers. There are links here to forms of financialization in varied ways around affordable and student housing. I guess one of the key points is that most densification in Joburg is occurring at least partially outside of formal policies. It's taking the form of intensified occupation of existing buildings through rental, different kinds of buildings, houses, high-rise inner city buildings, informal settlements, backyard shacks, location, industrial and commercial buildings. And this goes beyond a formal, informal binary. The actual processes are quite differentiated and nuanced. And I think the value of several of the articles in the book is to show those kinds of differences, to show the policy potentials inherent in different forms of informal densification. authors point to the need to understand social spaces and the different modes of densification, the different tenure and management systems in operation, the need to engage with them, but also the need to avoid romanticization. And yet, despite the significance of informal densification of different types, the state has failed to engage meaningfully with it. There have obviously been some attempts, but it ranges from displacing people to neglect to sometimes quite serious but difficult initiatives, to quite limited and partial initiatives and clumsy efforts to support. And what comes from the book and from the various authors, the need for greater sensitivity and productive engagement with the actual processes and their varying forms and contexts, and authors make various policy suggestions. So to conclude then, Joburg has many similar experiences to global cities, but we're learning from local inflections. It shows simultaneous processes of densification and de-densification and so-called sprawl. It's not either or, and there's a need to ground policy in an understanding of actual processes, especially since densification means very different things in different contexts. Joburg has advanced progressive policy, but with uneven outcomes, and there's a need to mobilize much more sustained political support to build appropriate institutional capacity and to link and integrate with other policies as well. The case raises the question about the role of real estate sector in the production of density and what is required to provide affordable housing. It shows the significance of informal densification, but its interactions with formal processes and the many different processes at work. And to come back to a point that Phil made, I think it points to a tension in international policy positions of promoting so-called good densification, which is nevertheless limited in terms of affordability and who can access housing produced in that way, and containing bad densification, which is produced through more informal processes, that is nevertheless accessible to the poor, and to go beyond this polarity as suggested by the contributors. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Alison. Okay, let me do the share screen. Won't people please turn off their videos if you could? Just a lot of people don't have bandwidth. Thank you so much. Great, can somebody just confirm that you can see the presentation?
We can, Margot.
Great, thanks, Sally. Okay, so it leads me to talk about the kind of topic of the day, and also to discuss the fact that we were right at the end of the process. We were putting the finishing touches to the book, and then COVID hit, and we sat there thinking, this is a key issue. We can't ignore it. We can't put it away. We have to engage with this idea of density and disease and of pandemic. And so while we were trying to synthesize all of the different chapters, while we're trying to think about it, we were also trying to think through what was happening in the current context, and also how to contextualize that within the longer history of cities and of densification and of disease, and how these different ideas relate to each other. And as much as cities have been very clear have had this very difficult history of thinking through density, it's been in many ways inculcated with this idea of disease and how density is closely related to notions of both moral and physical decay. And when there have been pandemics, this idea has become even more to the fore. And I mean, there's this great quote by Jefferson who says, the yellow fever will discourage the growth of great cities in our nation. And I view great cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. I mean, right there, one starts to get a real sense of the kinds of fears that were associated. And even in much of the kind of colonial planning that went on. There was this terrible kind of racialized notion of miasma that occurs from indigenous populations, and so cordon sanitaires, literally sanitary corridors, or sanitary kind of buffer zones, were instituted to separate the colonial population from the indigenous population. Once again, very much working from this notion that there was something inherently awful about the kinds of densities in which the indigenous populations were living, as compared to the kind of lower densities and more ordered realities of the colonial populace. And then even in our own context, and specifically within Johannesburg, I mean, Joburg went very quickly from a mining town into a bustling city, and with it, of course, came these massive slum yards right in the center of town. And if you look at the right, and then it's a figure of the location of all the different slum yards in Joburg. This is taken from Parnell's work, and you can as the population grew, the slums grew. It became more and more dense in terms of population. But with it became a whole series of fears around what that meant in terms of different race groups mixing, in terms of the passage of disease. And so in the 1930s, very much supported by the Slums Act in 1934, there were a whole bunch of new town planning ordinances which attempted to eliminate slums. And these can be seen as the instrumentalization of disease, or what Swanson has called the sanitation syndrome, really using the idea of disease as a way of pushing, of changing, of recreating kind of urban planning and urban settlement. And this was very much one of the things that pushed and redesigned the city of Johannesburg into a very segregated model, using these notions of both disease and of segregation and of racialized kind of separation as a key idea. So this is very much the history of what has happened within Johannesburg and the city itself. But now going into COVID-19 and density, one has to think about the fact that there is not a straight line density. Sorry, my daughter's just joined us. Come on. Sorry about that. They've been quiet for the last 45 minutes, so one should have expected that. But basically, when COVID initially hit, there was a lot of panic around the idea of density. And initially, there was a lot of conversations in the popular press and all other places about this idea that, oh dear, this is the end of cities. Were headlines that we were seeing. The time for cities has come and gone, for the kinds of things that we were seeing within the press. And very early on, there was a very big fear that, oh no, in dense places, we're going to see massive infection rates. And so the data started coming out, and we started being able to analyze it a bit more clearly. And then people like Richard Florida and others started to be able to give a more nuanced analysis. And much of it echoes the idea of good and bad density that we've already heard in the conversation. So Florida talks about rich, dense places where people can shelter in place, they can work remotely, can have all their food and other needs, and deliver to the... Okay, thanks, Bubs. And poor dense places, which push people out onto the streets and into stores and into crowded transit with one another. And so he makes this distinction between these ideas of what could be considered good density within the time of a pandemic, and bad density within time of a pandemic. But also we can start to think about how the geography of comorbidity and density. Poorer populations suffer disproportionately from diseases which are most likely to make them vulnerable to COVID. And also, they are the most likely to live in high density environments. And it's this combination between poor dense places and between the kind of geography of comorbidity that we start to see how the disease, how the pandemic has traveled, and start to understand some of the relationships between what is not density per se, but a range of factors and the disease. And then we also have to think about the question of infrastructure, services, and amenities. We know, for example, that in some of the poorest areas of the cities right across the world, in some of the most informal parts of the cities, these are often spaces with the fewest amenities, the worst access to services, and the lowest kinds of and the highest thresholds in terms of populations going to clinics and having those kinds of medical services available to them. So all of this creates a perfect storm. in which specific kinds of densities are a factor when matched with a host of other conditionalities to create vulnerability to to COVID and to this pandemic. And as such, not all cities and not all parts of cities, even with similar densities, have experienced the same infection or death rates. Poorer parts of cities, less well-serviced parts of cities, parts of cities with higher ethnic populations of various descriptions, migrant populations, have seen much higher infection rates, and with it, of course, densities, than other parts of the cities and other cities with the same densities. And I think that's a really interesting factor. In South Africa, what we've had is what I would call is the kind of misdiagnosis of density, and with it, a series of fairly dangerous kinds of decisions that have been made. And what we saw initially after the State of the Nation and disaster was declared is that the Department of Human Settlements, Water and Sanitation, Minister Sisulu, announced that we needed to think about the de-densification or the thinning of informal settlements. A whole bunch of different priority areas were identified for de-densification. There were proposals for relocating households into the new settlements, not far from their homes, we were told. And they were told that these would be safer and healthier for informal dwellers. And with it, there were these plans to fast-track development, to construct units, to push people into existing projects, even if they weren't complete, but to push the completion forward as soon as possible. And so the idea, certainly in Gauteng, was that somewhere in the region of about 14,000, if not more, people were to move into units that hadn't been completed. So there was a discourse that was coming out of the National Department of Human Settlements, which very much echoed this idea of density equaling disease, of equaling something that is bad. And so what Phil and Alison and have already said, which is the idea that although there may have been these moves and these shifts in theory and in the literature and in the academic circles around how we think about density, this hasn't necessarily been echoed in the work that's gone in policy circles and understanding that exists within practice. But having made all these plans, I'm not going to go through all of them, civil society, organizations, informal settlement groups, academics, all kinds of people came forward and said, look, the idea of moving people is really concerning. It's going to destroy social networks. How are you going to make sure that the process is equitable? How are you going to make sure that it's democratic? How are you going to make sure that it aligns with the huge amount of jurisprudence that exists around these particular issues? And also, massive concerns around delivery. We've seen a huge slowdown in delivery of housing for the last 5 or 6, if longer, last decade. How are we really going to be able to fast track delivery of units that will be in time to ensure that people get quality accommodation, and not accommodation which we've seen, which has been very much like the other temporary relocation sites, which have not been good, which have been really, really poor, and people have landed up living in them for long periods of time. And so there was a lot of concern around this idea of relocation, this matching again of density and disease, kind of historical memes were recurring. And there was also a very skeptical and slightly cynical view, which was saying, hey, is this not just a bit of cover that Minister Sisulu is using to camouflage her really long-standing intention to eradicate informal settlements, and the pandemic is merely a handy excuse? So there's a lot of concern around what was going on and what was driving it. The consequence has been that there's been a pulling back from that de-densification notion of the idea of thinning. We've heard a lot more about process over time. We've heard a lot more about the more progressive forms of informal settlement upgrading, reblocking, and so on. And so there's also been a greater emphasis placed on the provision of services, and understanding that it's not density which is the question to hand, but it's lack of amenities and lack of services which is problematic. It's the inability of people to be able to socially distance which is problematic. And to start to think about how you address those particular issues within the context of informal settlements, within high dense environments, rather than just thinking about relocate, and move people away. However, having said that, we are hearing that there are rumors about reports of hotspots being de-densified and taken over by the South African National Defence Force and put into more severe lockdowns, which once again raises huge concerns and points to the incorrect correlation that's being drawn between density and disease. So where do we land up? Well, I think COVID, like the book, in general has provided an opportunity to once again look more carefully at density, to consider its nuance, to consider context when thinking about it, to think about, oh, well, it's not actually density per se, but it's about the ideas of good density or bad density, or what are the geographies of density, what are the combining factors of density. And so to move away from an evangelical, what has sometimes been a very normative debate, and to examine the microprocesses and to use grounded and granular examinations of density to be able to lead policy and theorization. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to go now. So now I put on my separate hat. So if people could please turn off their videos, that would be really helpful. So we're now going to go into a discussion, question and answer session. If you could raise your hands, that would be super, and then I'll just call on you in order in which it happens. That would be great. Okay, so let me see if I've got hands coming up. Please, could people please turn off their videos? Are there any hands? Anyone wants to start? If I've missed you, please just speak out, because okay, thanks. I see Lene. Let's start with you.
Hi, thanks. Maybe should I just leave my video off? So the question that I have for the authors, people who wrote, who contributed to the book, obviously there's quite a few, so I'm not sure who can really answer this, but quite interested in how people kind of wrestled with the term densification, considering that they saw all these nuances and differences. And if during the process of writing the book, there were particular like vocabulary changes that people made, ways of describing densification just differently to what we are used to, and if they found that that was kind of more useful considering the context in which these studies were undertaken.
Super, thanks, Lene. Are any of the authors, Lene, you're asking authors and not editors, just to confirm?
Yeah, anybody who kind of thought about this question and about the terminologies, it's kind of open to whoever thinks that they have an answer.
Okay, great. Well, I'll open it to the editors, but also to any of our authors who have attended who might want to comment as well. Okay, Phil?
So, I think, look, I didn't have the opportunity to sort of engage with the social discourse around density, and that may be something of a weakness of the book, although not of all the chapters. But certainly looking at some of the international contexts, the popular discourse is around overcrowding and not density. And so whereas densification is very much the policy discourse, the talk on the street is about overcrowding. And it was very clear to me when visiting Moscow as part of our BRICS Plus City Lab, because Moscow is not a city with high densities in international terms, but there was a strong sense that people are living in overcrowded conditions. And this is really because of those apartment blocks which were built during the Soviet era, the Khrushchev era in the 1960s. And so whereas the Lincoln Institute and the World Bank were writing about how sustainable Moscow is in terms of its densities, it's a good density, it's not too dense, and it's not too sprawling. There was a very, very strong sense on the ground that people were living in overcrowded conditions. And I think that was quite instructive to me. So understanding the popular discourse is a good question. And I think one needs to look at it in the South African context as well, where there's been this aspiration to live as the white middle class lived, which were these, in these sprawling, low density suburban areas. And so the history which shapes the current perception and the current popular discourse is also really important.
Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. Does anyone want to pick up on the conversation? Alison, Ali, any of our authors? Okay. If not, no problem. Then, thanks. I'm going to move on to some other questions. Renigan, you had a question that you wanted to, or comment? And then on to Bongani.
I did. Thank you for the presentation. I look forward to reading the book. My question has to do with the role of corruption in densification, and in two regards. And so how the authors dealt with it, first empirically and second methodologically. Because it strikes me that particularly as, until recently, of course, we had lots of like overlapping policy documents governing the Johannesburg area. It seems to me that a lot of, well, I've heard in my own research that a lot of developers have exerted pressure here and there, and kind of used that, leverage that chaos to their own advantage to densify in areas where densification might not have been desirable. And so that's why I ask about the how the authors have dealt with that empirically, but it's been very difficult to track those down or to tell those stories and find the paper trails in the course of research. So that's why I ask also how the authors may have dealt with the issue of corruption, or even just leveraging informal kinds of control with government officials and others in their chapters. Thanks.
Thanks, Renigan. Alison, Ali, Phil, otherwise I can take a crack at it. Okay. You know, Renigan, it's an interesting question, and I was just thinking too about the actual work that I was involved in with the various chapters in empirical work, and I can't say that corruption came up particularly strongly in my work. We did see a lot of it. I mean, I was working with Sarah Charlton on backyarding with Phil and the Corridors of Freedom, and those politics and whatnot, and it wasn't. Yeah, I mean, we came across more of a kind of officials ignoring backyarding and really being at a little bit of a loss as to what to do with it than outright corruption or anything that I would think of in that score. So it wasn't a big issue that I think that I personally had to deal with in the work that I did, or the empirical work that I was involved with. In this case, I've worked on corruption in other contexts. Alison, Ali, Phil, do you want to comment, or any of the other authors?
If I can just add, I think it's probably more of a problem with large developers who are building like stain cities and Dane ferns and things. I mean, that's the context in which I've heard of it. But yeah, so I mean, I didn't necessarily expect it to come out of backyarding and things.
Yes, so I was going to say exactly that, Renigan. I was going to say where I have heard of it whispered in dark corridors is around the mega developments linked to property interests and politicians, but I could be flippant and say most of us want to live a long life, so maybe we don't want to explore that too deeply. But I think densification, the sort of processes around densification, which really involve maybe infill, more intense use of small existing sites, are less amenable. Not that there isn't corruption, not that property developers who are working in the inner city along the corridors don't exert policy influence, but I think it's very different from the large-scale property interests that may play out around mega developments and new cities and so on.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Alison, Ali, do you want to comment?
Well, I mean, in the work that we did around developers on the corridors, it didn't emerge, but, you know, I guess we didn't really dig that way, particularly. And it is tricky. It's, yeah, it becomes a huge ethical issue, I think, to start to raise it, and particularly also in the context of all the ethics processes we go through as well. But it didn't emerge in the corridors, which is as a discussion there, but which is not to say it's absent. I would have thought, though, that in the more informal processes, there is the potential with being sort of partly under the radar, not really following policy. So there's another space there, in the same way that there might be with informal traders and other informal entrepreneurs who aren't fully recognized. And there might be processes around that, but I can't comment, and perhaps other people who've done chapters on that might want to do that.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, I mean, I'll open it to authors, and also just I'm looking at the comments in the Zoom chat. I think, Mohammed, that partly answers your question as well, but if not, just write again in the chat so we can see how to clarify. Anyone else want to add? Okay, great. Then I think, Bongani, you had a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, the seminar. For me, in terms of densification, there are a few things that I thought were important. I mean, if you look at most of the cities that you have dealt with, those cities, I think 4 or 5 of them I've looked at, they are from the developing countries. I mean, if you look at the African one specifically, and New Delhi, I think there's a lot of informality in those cities. Are we looking here at densification as a way of trying to solve that informality, one, so that people go into the formal sector and be able to participate in the formal sector as well? And how do you close the gap in terms of pricing, so that those people that are, because the lack of housing is a problem as well. But the other important one, I'm not sure whether in this also, in the people that have been looking at this densification, I mean, there's a lot of buildings, you know, in Joburg, apparently, that have been hijacked, you know. I think some of those buildings, I mean, if you want to use them also to enhance provision of housing and things like that, what is the impact of that in this debate around densification and the space that is available in order to provide additional housing to people that really need those? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mungani. You were saying, are we looking at densification as a solution, from what I understand, to informality?
Yeah, no, I'm saying is this whole, is firstly the issue of densification, looking at getting rid of informality, in the sense that if you look at informality, I think one of the presentations raised the issue of infrastructure, and you know, for those people that are in the informal sector, lack of infrastructure, because I think if maybe you go that route of densification, you might provide them with a better infrastructure for them to either live or to work. And the second one, in areas where, for instance, in the city of Joburg, there's already existing buildings there, but because of those buildings that have been hijacked, I mean, how does that contribute in terms of also dealing with the issue of densification if buildings in the process are going to be hijacked?
Okay. I don't know if one of my colleagues wants to have a crack at this. I can also come in. Alison, Ali, Phil, anyone?
Go first, Margot.
Okay, cool. Sure. Bongani, we weren't looking specifically at first of all, this is not a policy recommendation book, so that wasn't really our perspective. And we weren't taking a normative position on density necessarily. What we were trying to do was to understand the processes by which densification happens, and trying to get to grips with why it happens in certain ways, how it is managed, how it is directed, and so on and so forth. And I think for a lot of us, we would argue that the kind of resident-led informality that we see both in informal settlements and in the backyards and in the inner city are very helpful and ensure that there's inclusion of poorer people into the city, where otherwise the property market and the land market would effectively exclude them. And I think the position that, speaking for myself, I would certainly take is not one of thinking about necessarily relocation or formalization, but rather support of the processes that do exist to ensure that the worst kinds of aspects of overcrowding and so on and so forth are appropriately dealt with, while keeping in place the very, to my mind, very useful and very strong forms of governance that exist at the micro scales within these sites. So that would be my take on it. Phil, do you want to come in?
Bongani, I think it's true that a lot of these sort of underlying assumptions in South African urban policy are that densification would bring the poorer people into the mainstream of the city, and that we do need to densify in the better located areas of the city. I think the assumption is there. I think the question, at least in the South African context, is the extent to which this is both possible and happening. I mean, we know that many of the private forms of densification are quite exclusionary and are not providing this ladder, if you like, from informality into formality. And the more public-led forms of densification, even if they've been implemented by the private sector, are very variable. So certainly the Corridors of Freedom was an attempt to bring poorer people, some of them living in informality, into the mainstream of the city and into more formal environments. But more careful analysis shows that because of the models of delivering housing, it's still very difficult to get to the bottom half of the population in terms of income. And it's sort of the upper, lower incomes, which are benefiting through these public sector-led processes. And so I think it's not that one shouldn't pursue this, but we have to recognize the limits of this and what really needs to be done to provide opportunities for the poor majority to get into the mainstream of the city. And I think the other cities, Sao Paulo, the favelas, Curitiba, where the poor are still very much on the margins of the city, Delhi, it's showing how poor that linkage is between informal and formal, and how difficult it is for densification processes, policy-led densification processes, really to resolve the challenges, if you like, that exist in the more informal areas of the city.
Super, thanks, Phil. Alison, Ali, do you want to add anything? So we've had some questions in the chat, which I just want to go through a little bit. So Dylan asked, okay, there's been some recent work in the USA on how planning policies that limit density effectively stifle the housing market, contributing to housing scarcity. Are any examples of these found in the book? As far as I'm aware, that's Shlomo Angel's work that you're thinking of. But no, we didn't deal with those issues in the book around how limiting density has had an effect on the land market. Not that I can think of. Alison, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I don't think that came up specifically in the cases. I mean, there's certainly a debate also going on with the attempts to push density in some cities with with different standards now being allowed. For example, in Melbourne, I think they were complaining about the denser developments coming up with rooms without windows. I think Sarah actually circulated some material from the UK raising concerns about how the push for more housing and more density was being associated with more slum housing or housing that is quite problematic in various ways. And I'm sure that that argument is being made, but it's not something that's specifically dealt with particularly in the book.
Super, thanks, Alison. Then Ivan, you had your hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
Thanks very much, Margot. I wanted to actually make a couple of points, if I could, to contribute to the discussion. If I'm not sure there'll be a question at the end of it. Is that allowed to make?
Absolutely, yep.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I mean, I think during the pandemic, we've learned an awful lot about density. Actually, it's been very revealing. I think the first point is that it's alerted us and made us even more aware, if we'd forgotten, how important density is for human interaction and for contact and for encounter. It's enriches our lives, but so socially it's vitally important, but also for the economy, it's also critically important. It fuels economic success. In a way, it's a kind of oxygen for society. And we've realized that the digital revolution that's been much hyped is not an effective substitute for face-to-face contact. So I think that's really, really very, very important. And the second point I want to make is around the economic aspect of density. Because of these positive properties of density, it causes great competition for space. And this is why, this connection between poverty and overcrowding comes around, because basically people are competing for space. It's not just where they live, it's also in taxi. You can see it in terms of people having their own car if they're affluent, as against people crowding into minibus taxis, right? The pressure on space results in overcrowding in workplaces, in where people live, in the kinds of places they shop and go for entertainment. So there is a connection between poverty and density, and it's because of economic power. And the third point I want to make is about the national response, because I think the national response and the provincial response has been very, very poor in understanding this key feature of the way the pandemic spreads through human interaction, precisely this valuable quality, the oxygen that I talked about, and the way it spreads that sort of intimate encounter between people. So the blunt measures of national lockdown and alcohol bans and tobacco bans really contrast starkly with the very micro scale at which it actually operates. And then the inability, because of this authoritarian, heavy-handed response, inability to engage with people and persuade them through their human behavior to minimize some of the interaction and so on that people search for. So the best example of this, I read the other day that the head of the Medical Research Advisory Committee, Medical Advisory Committee, is saying that KZN is going to be the next hotspot. Why did he say that? He said because KZN's density is higher than the density of the Western Cape, right? So the national scientists are understanding density at the wrong scale. That's not how the pandemic spreads at the scale of the province. It spreads at the micro scale. So cities are, written out of this conversation. Neighborhoods and communities don't feature strongly in our response to the pandemic. We haven't really thought about the modeling. As far as we know, we don't have access to it. As far as we know, if the modeling is taking place at the provincial level, that's really no good at all at understanding the real trajectory, the real dynamics of the pandemic. So I want to make a strong case. Basically, the density is critical, and we need to be making the case for understanding the way it works at the human scale as well as at the built environment scale, because of how significant it is. And I would, final plea, avoiding normative judgments and comments is all very well, but at the end of the day, this is critically important that we do engage with government around this pandemic on these density issues. Thanks.
Super, thanks, Ivan, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this. I'm just conscious of time and realize that there's just one more question that's come up. Dino, do you want to come in the conversation and just ask your question in person?
Hello, yes.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Dino Gumbaru. I'm from Montreal and currently in Dubai. So a really wonderful presentation. I learned so much. We're currently redoing the master plan in Montreal and addressing the issue of density, which in our case is very much based on a calculation of a floor area ratio versus a more broader metropolitan calculation of population density per hectare or so on. But I was wondering, in the example that were in the case studies, what would be the relationship between the identity of the city or the neighborhood and this notion of density? We know density can be a very database factor, but there are other qualities and so on that may touch more to the human. And I was wondering if there's any learning that could come up from there. I mean, in our city, we have had these battle between the identity of the neighborhood and the city versus a model of development that was mostly based on increasing density for return on tax. For instance, the city is getting about 85% of its budget from real estate taxes, which creates a situation of sometimes unbalance at the level of the administration. But I was wondering if this remarkable work has some lessons on these aspects. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dino. Do any of my co-editors want to engage?
I think, the one point that comes very strongly from the literature is the need to think about density in a rounded way and to think about the social, cultural and other dimensions of it, the design dimensions, etc., and not just work with numerically driven figures. And I mean, in policy terms, yeah, I mean, I guess in this context, I think we're still working with things like density targets. I think that's very often the case in other contexts too, but it's a very crude sort of thing, and it doesn't take into account the different experiences of density and the different ways it comes through, and the different and what is needed to actually manage it appropriately. So I do think that from the recent literature, there's very strong work that suggests the need for quite a rounded approach to thinking about density.
Great. Yes, thanks, Phil.
So all I would add to Ivan's comments, which I do agree with, is that density is structured in many different ways. And I think that's where the contextuality and nuance must come in. So the densities that are experienced in the tenements of Nairobi or some of the informal settlements in South Africa are very different to the densities in Shanghai or New York. And so it's just, I think one has to be very careful of just using the generic term in an overarching way, like density, and making statements about it. And that's why we do need to drill down more. So in relation to informal settlements, I think it's not necessarily incorrect that one needs to restructure the densities of informal settlements over time. But I think the problem is assuming that this process is connected to the pandemic and is going to do anything in terms of resolving the current crisis, which it clearly won't in terms of the different timeframes that are at play. And in fact, it might worsen the crisis by breaking family ties and neighborhood relationships. So I do think we need to engage very hard with national government around some of their plans. At the same time as building in a sort of greater complexity into discussions around density. But of course, cities are about density and agglomerations of density, and that's what makes cities work. But you can make different forms of density work better, and you can work to alleviate some of the negative outcomes of other forms of density.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. According to my watch, it's now 5:30. And I think we've managed to respond to most of the questions. I don't see any other hands up. So at this point, I would just like to say thank you very much to all of our attendees and to all of our speakers. It's clear that the issue of density, how to measure it, how to think about it, both in normal times, in inverted commas, and during the current crisis, are still extremely controversial. But having said that, let's keep thinking and keep chatting, and maybe there'll be a Densifying the City, volume 2, and we'll have to discuss all of these issues as well. But in the meantime, thank you so much for everyone who attended. Thank you to Lene and Alex who organized, and thank you to all the authors who made the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margot, and everyone.
Thanks, Ivan. Thanks, Lene.
There's just an announcement for next week, which is governing in a time of COVID, 4 cases of African cities. If people want to join, it will be a panel discussion.
Thanks, Lene.
Thanks very much. Terrific seminar. Much appreciated. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Rob.